Okay, now we're going to talk about application state. State is a huge part of React. So, what the heck is application state? Well, a really simple example is about water. You could say that water has three states. It's got solid when it's ice, and liquid, and it can be gaseous. And what changes when water changes from solid to liquid? Well, it's the change in state that happens. So what you can think about is this: when you talk about the state of water, you're saying that it currently has a certain condition. It doesn't mean that the underlying matter has changed. That is to say, frozen water is still water. And it's the same with a component. Say you have an input field. Whatever is in the input field is the current state. The data within the input field can change, and so it's mutable. So that's why we say the mutable data within an application is state. And the final thing to note is that it isn't persistent. Basically, when the page is refreshed, it's going to be reverted to an initial state, an initial condition. As with a form, most of the time when you refresh a page, the form will be emptied out. So you can just think of application state as it's mutable and it's not persistent. And a simple example of this is water, because it can have three different states: solid and liquid and gas. And that's what state is. Now we're going to be going over a couple more things to take away in this video. And these are the keys. Keys are very important. And there's going to be some new concepts mentioned. And I want you to watch out for them. And we could go into them more in depth later. But for now, I'm just going to say a little bit about what each of them are. The first one is controlled inputs. Now, we're going to be making a grocery list. And we want to control the input. That is to say, we're going to register the keystrokes of our input field. That is, we're going to make sure we recognize when they happen, and then we're going to inject the text back into the input component, so into the input field. So we're not going to rely on the HTML's ability to let us type in an input, but we're going to, and I think we can get an example of that right here. You see, just with plain HTML, just with plain HTML, we should have the ability to type in our component, but we don't want that. That would be an uncontrolled component, but what we want to do is register those keystrokes and inject them back into our input. And the reason we do that we can go over later. The next thing, the other new concept, is going to be constructor and super. And these are two things that deal with the creation of objects. Now remember, when we create a component, it just calls react.createComponent, createElement, and it turns your component into a plain JavaScript object. State is an object with key and value pairs inside that object. So you have your element, and then one of the keys on that element is called state, and it has a property which is an object with some variables in there. So to add state to our object, we have to call the constructor, which is a special JavaScript keyword, and you'll see this in action in just a moment. The final thing to pick up during this video is the binding of this. This is a special keyword in JavaScript that has to do with the execution context. And that is definitely a big word alert. It's definitely a concept that most people aren't familiar with, but what's important to know is that we're going to want our input to trigger a function every time it recognizes someone typing. To make the function and the input element stay within the same object, we need to bind the listening function. And basically, we just want to keep these two things connected, and you'll see that in the example. So that's what we have. We've got our application state, and we've got these three major keys. So let's jump into the code. Now, we're going to get rid of this, and I think at the last video, because we want to start all over. And at the last video, I'm pretty sure we just had this input and we had a button here. And that's all we need, right? So the first thing we're going to start off with is a place to store this data. Because we want to take this stuff here and we want to store it somewhere so that when we hit submit, we can output it. So we're going to store it in our state, because state represents the current condition, the mutable variables within a component. And because you can type in here, it's mutable. So we're going to use the constructor, which is a special function inside of objects, and then we're going to call super, which we can go over a little bit more later. But the important thing to know is we're just going to fix a object called state onto our object. So inside this object input, it's just going to be like this. It's going to be input is an object, and there's going to be a key in here called state, and it's going to have some things in here. All right? That's all that we're doing inside the constructor, is we're creating a state object on our element object. And inside the element, we're just going to name something called input, and we're going to give it an initial value of an empty string. We want it to be empty because when somebody loads this page, we want this to be empty. And then what we're going to do is we're going to inject that back into our input field. So to do that, we're going to use the value keyword, and we're going to say this.state, because remember, we're referencing this object, so we're going to say this, and then the state is the sub object, the child object that we just created, and then input is the key of this object. So we're going to say this.state.input. So that's going to give us the value that we're holding in state, and it's going to inject it back into this input object. So if we hit save, we're going to see something new here, where even though I am typing on my keyboard, I'm unable to type anything into this input, and that's because it's a controlled component. And if we were to put something in here like hello world, we would see that it would show up inside our input, and we wouldn't be able to alter it. So what we want is we now want to input things in there. And so the way that we do that is with an event listener. And you've probably used event listeners before when you've been using perhaps vanilla JavaScript, when you added an event listener, or when you did jQuery and did something like this with onClick and then some function. That would just be plain jQuery. But what you're doing here is you're adding an onClick event listener, so that way your element will listen for clicks. We don't want our element to listen for clicks. We want it to listen for keystrokes. So there's a special event listener called onChange. And remember, these curly braces are here because we're in JSX, and to write JavaScript in our JSX, we need to have the curly braces. Okay, so React has a lot of built-in event listeners. OnChange is one of them, and you can definitely find more of those out by reading the React documentation. I'll probably include a link in the description to the list of the event listeners. There's quite a few good ones. And remember, because it's JSX, we also always have to use camel case, so that's why it's onChange with a capital C. Okay, so we're going to give this a function that's also going to be in this object. So we need to reference the object, and then we need to call the function. And the function, we're just going to name it handleChange. And remember that key. Remember that key that was binding this? Well, to make sure that our handleChange function and our input reference the same object, that we're inside of, we have to make sure that they stick together. So we're just going to bind this. This just means I want to explicitly keep the context of this function to be inside this object. And you're going to see why that matters in just a second. So let's write that function. It's a handleChange function, and it's going to take in an event because just like in regular plain JavaScript, there are events from your listeners, and these guys give you a little bit of information about what's going on. In fact, there's a special value inside this event that we want to get, and it's called event.target.value. And let's just console log this for now, so you can see that. So you can see what's happening under the hood. So let's inspect it. And now what we expect to happen is that whenever this input is changed, it's going to listen this onChange event, it's going to trigger this function, and it's going to console log the event.target.value. So let's check our console and get all this garbage out of here and refresh our page. And you can see I'm just going to type hello. Okay, so you can see I'm outputting individual characters. Okay, so there's definitely some listening here. Now what we want to do is we want to save these inputs into the state. What we want, so that we can have these letters stack up on top of each other, is we want each letter to be injected into the state, and then for the state to be updated with this additional letter. And the way we can do that is with a function called setState. This is a function that's provided by React. Okay? And this function, it tells the React DOM that there's been a change inside this component. So we have to use setState if we want to update the current condition, the mutable data of our component. All right, so what part of state do we want to change? We want to change the input. And so we're just going to call input here. And we're going to set the value of input to our event target value. So now we can get rid of this console. Well, let's just keep it there for now, I guess. Now that we've updated it, you can see that there's a sort of a circular flow to the data here. Oh, and I should also mention that setState is a function that takes in an object, that object being state. Okay, just so you know what's going on there. setState is a function that takes in an object. So now let's try and type into the input. See, we can successfully type hello, and you see every single one of our keystrokes is registered here. So the reason that's happening is because we have this circular data flow. We have the input, and you can think that when we type, the onChange handler gets triggered. The onChange triggers this function, which sets the state, and then the state is injected back into the value. And this way we have this circle where to change a value, we have to trigger a function and then inject it back into the component. And this is called a controlled component. It allows us to do things like instant form validation and conditional button rendering and all fun things like that. Okay, so that's basically the basics of application state.